Avatar: The Last Airbender, an undeniable masterpiece of a show, which I'm sure we can all agree on, and if you disagree, I don't want to be friends with you. Anyone who's seen the show will fondly remember the lovable hijinks Team Avatar get up to, from Aang's childlike innocence to Katara's sweet-natured mothering, to Sokka's juvenile humor, to Toph's sisterly bantering. Avatar is a classic Nickelodeon kids show, arguably the greatest show ever broadcast on the network. And it's fun, it's silly, it's heartwarming, it's a nice, easy, comfortable watch to see these children go on their adventures in this wondrous, fantastical world. It's also unbelievably dark. In the same show as Aang airbending a little air scooter or playing such great pranks as dropping cakes on people's heads is a horrific cocktail of abuse, prejudice, and death. For every Sokka dad joke or cutesy penguin sledding, there's a multitude of propaganda, brainwashing, war, and abusive relationships. For every instance of Iroh only caring about food and tea, there's genocide, poverty, imprisonment, and severe social injustice. Avatar: The Last Airbender is my favorite show of all time. I mean, I even got a tattoo because of it, and my cat is named Momo, but underneath its sparkly, clean exterior, there's a deep, dark, insidious inside. I'm Pete from Pete Repeat, and join me as I explain to you how Avatar: The Last Airbender is way darker than you remember. Now, of course, I'll be talking about the entire show as part of this video, so if you haven't seen it yet, what have you been doing with your life? But seriously, I will be spoiling pretty much all of it, so fair warning. And of course, I will inevitably be covering some very dark topics such as prejudice, social injustice, brainwashing, war, death, genocide, psychological and physical abuse, and mental breakdowns. If you're not sure if you can engage with these topics safely, then I would recommend clicking off this video and watching another. Perhaps my previous one, where I talk about how video game music is better than the music you like. It's a touch more lighthearted. So, Avatar. On the surface, it is just a fun show, and if you engage with the show on that superficial level, it's still a great story. A ragtag team of kids banding together to try and save an interesting and diverse world, bending the four elements to their will and making lifelong friendships along the way, with allegiances forming and swapping on their path, with one kid living up to his destiny to save the world and mastering the control of all four elements. That sounds like so much fun. And it is. It's an incredible journey, and to watch Aang and his friends become stronger and overcome every single obstacle laid in their path, to treat adversity as a learning experience and understand other people and the world as a whole on a deeper and more meaningful level, what else is there to life but that? I mean, when Aang and some friends are trying to fight off some no-good evildoers, they do it with sticky stink bombs. That's silly. Haha, everyone laugh at the funny joke. Just don't think about the fact that this is an invasion during a war between the entire world that's been going on for over 100 years. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into the rest of the video here. I've had quite a few issues with copyright in this video, so if you see me doing some weird stuff to the footage, I apologize. There's just things that I gotta do to make the video watchable, and that's make it less watchable. You're welcome, and I'm sorry. Back to the video. So, yeah, there's some darker stuff under the surface, and some of it, while engaged with in as much depth as a Nickelodeon show can, is more shown through visual storytelling and not addressed directly. This doesn't apply to everything, of course, but on a first watch of the show, you might miss some of this stuff. One of the things that is talked about, albeit mostly lightheartedly, is sexism. In the show, one of the first character arcs we see is Sokka's battle with sexism. After the opening title exposition of the first episode, Sokka and his sister Katara try and fail to catch a fish, and then crash their boat, leaving them stranded on some ice. While they bicker about whose fault it was, Sokka says, "Leave it to a girl to screw things up." Which is pretty on the nose. While Sokka thinks himself the leader of their tribe in the South Pole because all of the rest of the men have gone away, making him the man of the tribe, I'm noticing a pattern here, this underlying sexism is brought into focus just a few episodes later, when he, Katara, and Aang are confronted with the Kyoshi warriors, a group of fearsome fighters entirely comprised of women. They immediately get the better of Team Avatar, because of course they do, and Sokka can't believe some girls could possibly best him in a fight, or more specifically,
"Who are you? Where are the men who ambushed us? Wait a second, there's no way a bunch of girls took us down."
Through the course of the episode, Sokka then has to come to terms with the fact that he is in fact not a mighty warrior, and he learns his lesson, seeking training from the Kyoshi warriors and even donning their uniform to empower himself. Hell yeah, feminism! But of course, that's not the only sexist thing the Water Tribe is associated with, is it? Because when the gang finally make it to the North Pole in search of a waterbending master who can teach both Aang and Katara waterbending, it turns out that only the men can be taught how to fight, while the women have to use their waterbending abilities to heal instead. This one is handled less well, I'd say, with Master Paku only eventually allowing Katara to study under him because they have a familial link that's uncovered, with no one really learning their lesson. But Katara fought him and stood her ground for a bit, so hell yeah, feminism. As it goes though, sexism is one of the few things in the show that's rarely brought up because most of the world is actually pretty inclusive when it comes to gender. But sexism isn't the only kind of prejudice present in the show, so let's talk about xenophobia, I guess. There's a more subtle showcase of cultural prejudice in the show, and examples of it being more overt, more on that later. For example, returning to the very first episode of the show, Boy in the Iceberg, after Aang is discovered to be a boy in an iceberg, that's what the episode is named after, Sokka is immediately distrusting of him because he's not from around here.
So, do you guys live around here?
Don't answer that. Did you see that crazy bolt of light? He was probably trying to signal the Fire Navy.
After they get back to their village, and after Aang is a little rascal and accidentally signaled the Fire Navy, maybe he was a spy that whole time, he's banished, Sokka making sure to say,
"The foreigner is banished from our village,"
with the elder of the village also saying,
"Sokka is right. I think it best if the airbender leaves."
While they have reason to distrust him at this point, with the Fire Navy closing into their home, and the war that's destroyed their home and way of life, you can definitely tell that there's a hint of a cultural motivation underneath it. The Southern Water Tribe are incredibly sheltered, and closed off from the rest of the world, and they folded inwards as a result, only trusting those within their own ranks. But this stuff is all kind of minor to a degree. There's a much more heartbreaking instance of this injustice in the best Avatar episode, Zuko Alone. Throughout the story to this point, the Fire Nation have been positioned as the out-and-out villains. Pretty much every single antagonist you can think of comes from the Fire Nation, and while there's a character or two who can lighten the perception of the country, thank you Iroh, the overwhelming feeling is Fire Nation bad. And this understanding isn't just for the viewer of the show, every other nation in this world believes it too. The Fire Nation started the 100-Year War. They're the ones who've caused so much pain and struggle and loss. They are the villains. Granted, there were glimmers of bad people existing in other nations too, like Jet and General Fong, but regardless of those people being bad, it never made the Fire Nation look good either. So when the Crown Prince of the Fire Nation, Zuko, finds himself having abandoned the Fire Nation entirely, he's struggling to make his own way, having to hide who he is and his powers. Coming across a small Earth Kingdom village, Zuko takes shelter, becoming close to a family there. He becomes something like an older brother to a young boy named Lee, a replacement for Lee's actual older brother Sensu, who's off fighting in the 100-Year War. I'm sure nothing terrible will happen to him. Zuko shows Lee how to use his dual swords, and Lee even says directly that he thinks Zuko would get along with Sensu. But later on, Zuko comes to blows with members of the Earth Kingdom army, who'd been forcing their will over the village, taking advantage of the fact that all those who were able to were off fighting in the war. Zuko stood up for himself and the village, with people cheering him on, fighting for the freedom of Lee, who'd been taken hostage. But after he can't overcome the leader and his earthbending, he resorts to using his firebending, outing himself as a member of the Fire Nation and revealing his true identity as Zuko, Crown Prince to the throne. He defeats the tyrannical leader of the group of soldiers and frees Lee, which causes Lee to rethink his stance on how he thinks about the Fire Nation and its people. Oh, wait, no, sorry. There appears to be a mistake in my notes. What happens is...
It's yours. You should have it.
No, I hate you.
I hate you. after finding a potential replacement for his brother, who at this point is heavily hinted to have been killed on the front lines of battle. Lee can only see a firebender, an enemy. All he can feel is hatred. But the beauty of a show like Avatar is the prejudice doesn't just run in the characters in the show. You, the viewer, is also susceptible, because the show intentionally only shows you the soldiers, the villains, the evil parts of the Fire Nation, Iroh excluded. You then believe the Fire Nation is bad. It's what we're told. Everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked, not Fire Lord Ozai attacked, or the Fire Nation soldiers attacked. The Fire Nation as a whole was wrong. The Fire Nation is the villain, which means that every other nation are the good guys, until you're forced to question your own beliefs that the show has led you to. In episodes like the Avatar state, we see a war-obsessed Earth Kingdom general wanting to protect his people, yes, but also willing to essentially torture Aang, seeing him as a tool rather than a person, wanting to wield and control his massive power during his Avatar state. In the episode The Puppet Master, we meet Hama, who is her own terrifying can of elbow leeches, which I'll get to later, but you get to see a villainous member of the Water Tribe, someone who enjoys inflicting pain on others and wanting her power to actively be passed to other people so they can be corrupted by it too. And in the headband, which comes at the start of the very last season, we finally get to see the normal side of the Fire Nation. In the final season of the show, we get to see not the military, not the politicians, not the royalty, but the regular people. School kids going about their normal daily lives, not really knowing how the rest of the world views them. They have your typical problems that any other teenager would. And it makes you, the viewer, stop for a second and realize the mistakes you've been making, the prejudices that you unknowingly had in your mind up to that point. But it's not your fault that you were led to believe what you did, because even the characters in the show are fed propaganda at every corner. Let's talk about propaganda. In the same episode, The Headband, we get to see how Fire Nation history has been papered over to make their own country look superior. Boy, I wonder if that ever happens in the real world. When Zuko finally turns on his father in the episode The Day of Black Sun, he says,
"Growing up, we were taught that the Fire Nation was the greatest civilization in history, and somehow, the war was our way of sharing our greatness with the rest of the world. What an amazing lie that was. The people of the world are terrified by the Fire Nation. They don't see our greatness. They hate us, and we deserve it."
While the propaganda to this point had been hinted at and vaguely mentioned, this is the first time it is outright declared. And suddenly you understand why a nation is so willing to do what they've done. They wanted their prosperity for everybody else. But of course, war is never really about sharing, is it? But this propaganda, as well as being shared around on a national level, is propagated on a micro level from person to person. In the episode Jet, we see how the eponymous Jet can take advantage of those who've been wronged by the Fire Nation to reinforce those feelings of despair and hurt and grief, and twist them to make sure that all of the Fire Nation is positioned as the villain, and anything Fire Nation related must be eradicated. It's a horrible, painful cycle. But of course, because Avatar is the greatest show ever created, there's also the perfect scene to counteract this prejudice and judgment, and it tells you how you should be thinking, how the world should be thinking, and showcases just how broken everything and everyone is. Bitter Work might be one of my favorite episodes in the entire show. It's what inspired me to get my tattoo, and the scene in question is Iroh explaining to Zuko how you can't set yourself apart from the rest of the world. We are all connected, and cutting yourself off and thinking you're better just makes you inferior, or in his words, rigid and stale. Knowing, understanding, and taking inspiration from all cultures is what makes the world better. It restores balance. The Avatar is so powerful because they can control all four elements together. Team Avatar becomes whole when they're joined by a firebender to go along with their waterbender, airbender, and earthbender. It's all so poetically linked together, and while it may be a fairly basic message of don't be xenophobic, it's packaged in such a unique and powerful way where we can actually see the results of people who combine forces from different cultures being superior to those who don't. Bless Iroh. He's the best. But not every social issue has a neat episode showing you the other side of it. Some are shown to you and just left to sit there, reminding you that yeah, this exists, and it sucks. For example, poverty. Different classes of people are shown all across the world, from the Water Tribe to the Earth Kingdom. Throughout the whole show, there's a constant divide and conflict between those of lower classes and those of higher ones, whether it be the comparison of the Southern Water Tribe's tiny little village to the Northern Water Tribe's palaces, regal proceedings, and feasts, or the humble villagers in the Earth Kingdom compared to the enormity of Ba Sing Se. Curiously, we never really see this class conflict in the Fire Nation. While there are definitely those of a higher social status and class than others, such as the royal family and their pals, those of a lower class are never really shown to be poor or impoverished. They seem to be more of a middle class equivalent. The one exception would be the village shown in The Painted Lady, though the blame for their endangerment is more placed at the feet of the one fire army factory that moved in, rather than a much larger societal problem. I just think it's interesting, given that the propaganda that was fed to the Fire Nation's populace was that they were sharing their prosperity and peace with the rest of the world, which may have been much more believable if that prosperity was genuine. Anyway, the most overt example of poverty and its effects in the show can be seen within Ba Sing Se itself. The city's rings are explicitly designed to wall off people into their respective social classes, keeping the poor people away from the rich people and ensuring the poor remain poor. The only way to move up the class structure would be if you're incredibly lucky and/or someone from a higher class needs you for something, as is shown with the rich guy who pays for Iroh to have his own tea shop in the upper ring. Those left in the lower ring are offered very little, relying on only themselves, with a heavy presence of guards and Dai Li to ensure nobody does anything out of line. Doing something out of line, of course, could be doing something to try and save yourself and help you out of your dire situation. For example, like the man who tries to mug Iroh in the episode The Tales of Ba Sing Se, someone who Iroh takes pity on because he can see the pain and despair the man is in because of his social situation. Just listen to the way that the social structure is attempted to be justified with tour guide Judy.
What's that wall for?
Oh, Ba Sing Se has many walls. There are the ones outside protecting us, and the ones inside that help maintain order.
Maintaining order. In other words, ensuring the status quo is upheld. Poor remain poor, rich remain rich.
This is where our newest arrivals live, as well as our craftsmen and artisans, people that work with their hands. It's so quaint and lively. You do want to watch your step, though.
Why do they have all these poor people blocked off in one part of the city?
Why indeed, Katara? Why indeed? While this might seem a little fantastical to have literal walls closing off sections of a city to maintain the class structure, it's actually not that far removed from reality, though instead of literal walls, they're more often implied walls. You have those in poorer neighborhoods in every city, those sections remaining poor because the status quo is upheld, and certain systems that the majority of Western societies live by are designed to maintain that structure. And in the show, there's not much resolution to any of it. Even by the end of the show, where Aang and Zuko promise to build a better future, there's an underlying acknowledgement that a lot needs to be done in order to achieve that lofty goal. Stopping Fire Lord Ozai is all well and good, but that doesn't solve these issues. That is a much bigger global problem. On a separate note, there's also that one episode where they mock the criminal justice system and how laughably cartoonish it is, and, well, yeah, it kind of is. It's played for laughs more than anything, but it kind of is an actual accurate depiction of how some criminal justice is carried out in real life, and that, in and of itself, is terrifying. But all of this, all of these social injustices, the sexism, the xenophobia, the propaganda, the poverty, the flawed criminal justice system, are just one very small part of the darkness in Avatar. It goes without saying that Avatar, above all else, is a show about war. The mechanisms involved in it, and more than anything, the consequences of it. When Aang is found in the iceberg, the war between the Fire Nation and the rest of the world had been going on for 100 years. 100 years. Like, two of the most globally devastating wars that we've ever experienced are, of course, World War I and World War II, and combined, they lasted for 10 years. 1/10 of the time that this war has been ongoing. Just those numbers alone should be able to paint the picture of how horrific this period of time would be. But first, let's look at some of the people affected by war. Refugees are common throughout Avatar, those displaced by conflict in their hometowns and cities, and are always shown to be suffering because of it. Whether it's the couple that have to make their way through the Serpent's Pass, the tribes making their way through the Great Divide, the mechanist who makes his new home in the Northern Air Temple, more on that in a bit, the freedom fighters led by Jet, or the sheer amount of them that have found their new home in Ba Sing Se's lower ring, hoping for a new start.
I can't believe how many people's lives have been uprooted by the Fire Nation.
We're all looking for a better life, safe behind the walls of Ba Sing Se.
I wonder how that'll go for them. We are reminded pretty frequently through the show of these innocent people who are deeply affected by the war, being forced to rip up their roots and make their way somewhere else, just hoping to get a fresh start. Even Iroh and Zuko, former members of the Fire Nation royal family, ousted from the Fire Nation, take up the same path as many others and end up in Ba Sing Se. And some of those refugees in turn cause pain elsewhere on their journey too, either through necessity or unintentionally. For example, people can take up lives of crime or subvert the law just to get by, like the man who attempts to mug Iroh in Ba Sing Se, or the mechanist and his family who take up their home in the Northern Air Temple, and through their roots spreading just by need of survival, in Aang's eyes they betray what the temple means, losing its heritage. The cycle of pain continues. And let alone prisoners, with prisons and encampments being not only common in the Avatar world but brutal as well, shutting off earthbenders from any form of earthbending, shutting off waterbenders from any water aside from when they are forced to drink some after they've been tied up, only giving Iroh food that's been dropped on the floor. Prisons are shown to be the absolute dirt worst of the Avatar world. Even the Fire Nation imprisoning firebenders in the Boiling Rock don't follow their own rules and ensure they maintain an unfair ruling system to cause the most amount of pain they can and wield their power over those less fortunate. It's horrible, especially for a kids show, to display quite plainly the trauma experienced through imprisonment. Imprisonment is what led to Hama becoming the Puppet Master, which I will talk about in this video, as much as it terrifies me too. And these are just the primarily civilian population affected by the war. We're not even taking into account those who are actually fighting in it. We hear of people being captured, injured, and dying. The first episode of Book 2 says it best.
That's the infirmary, and those soldiers are the lucky ones. They came back. Every day the Fire Nation takes lives. People are dying, Aang.
Which then brings me to the next dark part of Avatar. Death. But not just the act of dying or people losing their lives, but the sheer toll and weight it leaves on the people left behind. There's hardly any actual death in the show because again, it's on Nickelodeon, so the focus naturally shifts to the living, and the price death pays on them. There's more subtle instances of death affecting people, such as the little look some smaller characters give when they mention they lost someone close to them, that far-off look of hurt and betrayal. And of course there's much more overt examples. Death permeates every main character of the show, so let's do a rundown. Aang in the initial couple of episodes of the show is portrayed as a little prankster, a guy who's always good for a laugh, he enjoys being a kid and having fun. Throughout the episode called the Southern Air Temple, which is, by the way, the third episode in the whole show, Aang is showing Katara and Sokka his home that's since been invaded by the Fire Nation with nobody left living there. Aang is purposefully not acknowledging what has happened, refusing to believe that this level of devastation is even possible, with Katara and Sokka protecting him from the truth too, battling with the reality that at some point they have to tell and show him what's happened.
You know, you can't protect him forever.
Until Aang sees it himself. He discovers the decayed skeleton of his friend, Monk Gyatso, and just that visual alone is enough to send Aang into a terrifying spiral. For the first time you see not an innocent child, but a pained and struggling person, someone who is now bearing the burden of knowing that his people are no more. He's being forced to deal with an adult level of trauma and pain while still being a child, which is in perfect juxtaposition to just 2 episodes earlier, in the first episode of the show, when Aang convinces Katara to go penguin sledding with him. Katara, someone else who's been forced to take up adult levels of responsibility and dealing with the trauma of her own childhood, remarks that,
I haven't done this since I was a kid!
to which Aang wonderfully replies,
You still are a kid!
Aang not yet understanding what has happened in the world in the 100 years he's been in the iceberg, or even understanding that he's been in an iceberg for 100 years, doesn't understand that kids can't just be kids anymore. Because of war, because of death, they don't get a carefree childhood anymore. Something that's brought into sharp focus when Aang can't handle the death of Monk Gyatso or his people anymore. Katara and Sokka, meanwhile, have also had to deal with close personal death. Losing their mother when they were both very young, Sokka went on to focus harder on becoming a warrior, to protect those around him, to ensure that pain doesn't happen again. He still feels the pain. He doesn't enjoy remembering or recounting the tale of when she died, as he does to Zuko. But Katara, well, that's a different story. While Katara seems like a kind, good-natured presence superficially, there are moments peppered throughout the show that bring her pain at losing her mother closer to the surface. She frequently references her mother's necklace, the last remaining piece of her she has left, and is distraught when she loses it in the episode Imprisonment, and is disappointed when she can't wear it as part of her disguise in the Fire Nation. In The Runaway, Sokka mentions that Katara can be very motherly and overbearing, but that's because they lost their actual mother, and Katara had to step in.
I never told anyone this before, but honestly, I'm not sure I can remember what my mother looked like. It really seems like my whole life, Katara's been the one looking out for me. She's always been the one that's there. And now, when I try to remember my mom, Katara's is the only face I can picture.
You can see what these words mean to Katara, how touched she is that her actions in protecting Sokka and her tribe are appreciated, and how devastating it is for her that Sokka can't remember what their mother looked like. In the Crossroads of Destiny, she says directly to Zuko, tears flowing in her eyes, that he doesn't know what this war has done to her personally.
The Fire Nation took my mother away from me.
And that there is the core of Katara's character. That is what drives her. That is what fuels her hatred of the war and the quest for peace. And it's that drive, that pain and anger that also distorts her desires and puts her on a quest for revenge. The Southern Raiders is one of my favorite episodes of the show. It's such a mature take on what grief can do to a person and the concept of forgiveness. Katara, after being told that she could get to meet the person who killed her mother, becomes obsessed, thinking that what she needs more than anything is revenge. Her and Zuko journey to find this person, and you can tell just how much this personal quest means to her, because in the heat of the moment at potentially finding the man responsible, she uses bloodbending. And you can see Zuko's shock, only reinforcing the passion that she has to exact revenge on this man. I'll talk more about this later. This is the toll death takes on the living. It shapes them, changes them, bringing out a side of a person that you otherwise wouldn't see. This doesn't feel like Katara in this episode. This feels like a darker, more twisted version of her. Next on the list is Zuko, and Zuko? Well, Zuko, for the show, is under the impression that his mother is dead, and while that turns out to not be true, he still lives his life for the duration of the show, holding that same weight and loss that others do. Zuko's mother was his support, his linchpin in the family and his shield, so when she's gone, and Zuko is left all alone, it opened him up to the horrors of the rest of the family. Iroh's struggles with death aren't as obvious because he wears his good-natured persona at all times, but his love for Zuko and the undying want for him to be protected and safe is born from the loss of his own son.
Ever since I lost my son,
Uncle, you don't have to say it.
I think of you as my own.
Iroh sees the hurt that Zuko has been through and positions himself as the new father figure, and while he tries to be patient and caring at all times, there are a couple of occasions where the mask slips. In the Tales of Ba Sing Se, we see Iroh on the day of his son's birthday. He helps everyone around the city, making a child stop crying, helping children out of a tight corner when they kick a ball through a window, putting a flower into its ideal lighting for it to flourish, even helping a man attempting to mug him, sitting down, speaking to him, and guiding him to a brighter future. But then he goes to celebrate what would have been his son's birthday, and you see that all he tries to do is help, but he could not help his son. As the tears begin to flow, you feel that no matter how much time has passed, the pain doesn't go away. He may be able to be content in his day-to-day life, finding pleasure in simplicity, but there will always be the pain and loss deep within him. It was his son's death that caused him to be disillusioned with the idea of war and the Fire Nation as a whole, or at the very least, the seed was planted because of it. And this manifests into changing his entire outlook on existence and the decisions he makes in the rest of his life. Death changes people. There's also the complicated character of Jet. Jet, who lost his family and home due to the war, goes on to want the same kind of revenge that Katara wanted. Though, while Katara's is more focused on the one person who did her wrong, Jet's takes on a wider scale, wanting to rid the world of the Fire Nation entirely. The pain he holds within him even skews his morality, meaning he's willing to let innocent villagers die as long as it means getting rid of the Fire Nation, in a way, becoming that which he hates. But death doesn't stop there for Jet, because while there barely is any death in this show, there is some, and Jet is one of those people. While the show leaves it somewhat vague, it's pretty heavily implied that Jet will not make it. And Jet's death in turn continues the cycle of pain and grief with Longshot and Smellaby, as well as, for the first time, Toph having to confront death as well. There are countless others throughout the show who are dealing with, have dealt with, or will deal with the consequences of death, and Avatar goes out of its way to show how messed up people can become because of it. It shows more than anything that each person has an individual path, and that path can be turned any number of ways by the experiences they have, the upbringing they're exposed to, and some can even stop abruptly. But these are mostly individual deaths, losing a person or people close to you and how it affects a single person. But there's one other instance of death in this show. It's mentioned right from the get-go, but the horrifying implications are both focused on, and yet oddly not focused on enough. The Fire Nation wiped out an entire culture in the Air Nomads. That is known as genocide. This might hit a little close to home for some people, but genocide is a very real and very painful experience for many. Genocide is something that has permeated and shaped our world. In Avatar, there are only really 4 cultures, 4 nations, and they lose 1/4 of it. By genocide. By armies rolling in and literally slaughtering everyone. Men, women, children, it wouldn't matter. Every single person except Aang was killed. Can you imagine how different the world would have been had this not occurred? All those paths I just spoke about, all the different directions a person's life can take, there's no paths for any of the Air Nomads anymore. And just think, if Fire Lord Sozin had got his wish and he actually had wiped out all the Airbenders, Aang included, he would have, in theory, eventually wiped out the Avatar cycle. There would be no more Airbenders at all, which means that the next Avatar after Aang would be in the Water Tribe, the one after in the Earth Kingdom, the one after in the Fire Nation, and then what would be after that? There wouldn't be an Air Nomad for the Avatar to be born into, so would the Avatar simply not exist anymore? Would they skip the Air Nomads and go back to the Water Tribe? I can't reinforce enough the dire and severe butterfly effect that would occur if airbending as a whole was completely wiped out. Granted, we see in The Legend of Korra how airbending makes its return, but it could be said that this wouldn't have happened if Aang had not survived the genocide, as Korra wouldn't have been born yet to take up the mantle of Avatar next. The show constantly reinforces the need for balance, for the other cultures to respect and learn from each other, and if there were no more airbenders ever, this balance would be imbalanced, permanently. There would have been hundreds if not thousands of lives taken in the raid of the Air Nomad temples, and that really cannot be understated. That is a huge percentage of this world's population. It was absolutely devastating to the state of the world and a completely reprehensible evil act. But somehow, we're not done. There's an entirely different side of evil and darkness in Avatar that I haven't spoken about yet, and now, I think it's time. Avatar is a show that is rife with abuse. And it feels weird to say that, but when you spell it out, there's no denying it. There's many different forms and the severity of it differs, but it's there through the whole show. It's honestly quite surprising how much the creators were able to get away with showing, because when you put it all together, it's really bleak. One of the outcomes of abuse is control over another person. Whether that be physical, psychological, or otherwise, a level of control is what abusers often strive for. The way this control takes shape can manifest in many varied behaviors, and there's a lot of them in Avatar. Let's start with one of the most overt examples: brainwashing. One of the big conspiracies in the show is the control the rulers of Ba Sing Se place over its residents. To prevent chaos within the city, the advisor to the king, Long Feng, has ensured that the 100-Year War not be mentioned within the walls of Ba Sing Se. So this awful, dreadful war that's resulted in the presumed death of thousands of people, sending traumatic shockwaves across the world, including a genocide of an entire culture, to some people, it doesn't exist. But as mentioned before, there are refugees hoping to get their new starts within Ba Sing Se, and they quite obviously have knowledge and first-hand experience of the war. But they're not allowed to mention it, because if they do...
There is no war within the walls. Here we are safe. Here we are free.
It's Jet again, and his insistence in Zuko and Iroh being firebenders and becoming obsessed with exposing not only their identities, but the 100-Year War, something which he is absolutely correct about, results in his mind being tampered with, and him being brainwashed to forget everything about the war. But Jet's not the only one. When the gang first make it to Ba Sing Se, they are welcomed by Ju Di, who immediately gives off weird, unsettling vibes from the get-go. She guides the heroes around Ba Sing Se, explaining their weird walls that are used to maintain the status quo that I mentioned before, while also ignoring their request to meet with the Earth King. After the troop decide to take things into their own hands and attempt to meet the Earth King themselves, they and Ju Di are taken away, only for someone else to appear, also claiming to be Ju Di. That's weird, but maybe they just have the same name, might be a common Earth Kingdom name. Only for later on, the original Ju Di to appear, saying she'd just taken a little vacation, nothing to worry about. But when it's discovered where she took her vacation and Aang and co go to investigate, it results in one of the most unsettling shots of the entire show, where they walk past a room where a bunch of Ju Dis are in the process of being programmed on how to behave.
I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se.
I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se.
We're so lucky to have our walls to create order.
We're so lucky to have our walls to create order.
The way the camera is positioned to be uncomfortably close with an almost fisheye lens of distortion on the edges make this shot look incredibly eerie, but more than that, if you really break this down as well, these are all people, actual humans with lives and maybe families out there that have been presumably taken and reprogrammed to be Ju Di. Or if they haven't taken these people when they're adults, then more disturbingly, they've been taken when they were children and groomed for the role. Or even worse, somewhere within the Lake Laogai hideout, there could be a birthing clinic where people give birth to children that will become Ju Di. It's really, really uncomfortable to think about. So that's brainwashing in Avatar, taking control of somebody's mind. But what happens when you take control of someone's body? Let's talk about bloodbending. The Puppet Master is an outrageously amazing, creepy, and horrifying episode of Avatar, taking place deep into its third and final season. We'd seen hints of the boundaries of what was possible with the power to bend the elements through the show. Toph learning how to metal bend, Boomy being able to bend with only his face, Iroh inventing redirecting lightning, so we know that there's a bit more to bending than we've seen so far. There's always new ways that bending can be molded and shaped to do new things. And that's when the party meets Hammer. She seems a little odd at first, a little unsettling, but a kind-natured waterbender from the Southern Water Tribe, who'd taken up residence in the Fire Nation. Now, why would she be here? Just don't think about it, probably not important. Through the course of the episode, we see Hammer's progression of waterbending, being able to bend the water out of plants, killing them, which is a novel and interesting, if slightly uncomfortable way to use your abilities. But if you can take the water out of plants, what happens when you turn your attention to something else that is mostly made up of water? What happens when you try to waterbend the water within people?
Blood bending.
This is one of the most frightening things in the show. The ability, as Hammer describes it, to control the water in another body, enforcing your own will over theirs. The way this is animated only adds to its terrifying implications, with the people who are affected by bloodbending shown to be alarmed, in pain, unable to comprehend what's happening to them. Here's a funny and not at all mind-melting little side question. If the water can be ripped out of plants, could it in theory be ripped out of humans too? This is of course never done on the show because I think it might make it a little more than a PG rating, but like, they could make the water burst out of a person's skin, instantly killing them in a horrific and gory explosion, kind of like this, but with water, which sounds awful. The way that the ability is used in the show, though, is body control, a way to physically manipulate somebody and act in the way you want them to, which in and of itself is an abhorrent thing to do. A bloodbender is literally taking control of someone's body without their consent and using it for their own means, and if that sounds really similar to something else that happens in real life, then yeah, that's by design. Hama alone in the episode it's introduced uses this power for a number of effects, kidnapping members of the village, making them walk their own way to the mountaintop, and forcing Aang and Sokka to fight each other. After Hama discovers that Katara is a waterbender, she knows that she has one new goal in life now. She discovered bloodbending and used it to escape from her prison, but now the technique would die with her. She needs somebody to continue her legacy, and that person, willing or not, will be taught it. She teaches Katara its capabilities, and when Katara refuses to use it, not wanting to have that level of power over somebody's bodily autonomy, Hama takes matters into her own hands, charging Aang and Sokka at each other with Sokka's sword drawn, moments away from Sokka impaling Aang. Katara has no other choice but to bloodbend Hama, stopping her waterbending and freeing Aang and Sokka. Hama's lesson is complete. Katara is a bloodbender. That's how the episode ends, with the uneasy tension and realization that while Hama was arrested and taken away, she won. And there's also the fact that Hama was manipulating children to do all of this, which makes the whole thing even more messed up. But that's not the end of bloodbending, because it makes one more appearance in the show. I mentioned it earlier, but do you remember that one little scene where Katara goes on a revenge quest to find the man that murdered her mother, and in the moment where she thinks she's found him, she subdues the man, forcing him to the ground and compelling his face to look upwards so she can look him in the eye. And she does it all with bloodbending. This rage and anger that fuels her explodes with this use of an ability that she vowed never to use, something that she knows is a terrible, horrible thing to do to somebody. Hama's legacy lives on. She gave Katara the tools to become a bloodbender, and Katara, in an outburst of sorrow and vengeance, uses it. It's an incredibly effective way to portray what this mission means to her, and Zuko's moment of pause to acknowledge the level of power Katara is displaying at that time only hammers that point home further. Bloodbending is cruel, twisted, and sadistic, a power only shown to be destructive and harmful. But the brainwashing, the bloodbending, while really messed up when you think about them, there's still a level of disconnect between them because they're fantastical in nature. There's a level of magic involved. But there's something else in this show, another layer of abuse that doesn't use any magic or bending. It's just as real and as raw and as realistic as anything that could happen in the real world. I made a statement earlier. I said, "It goes without saying that Avatar, above all else, is a show about war." I don't know if that's true. I think it could be interpreted that way, but I think more than that, Avatar is a show about trauma. It uses war as a vehicle and a catalyst for some of that trauma, but there's also physical and psychological abuse that causes it as well. And that's what I think Avatar is about, an exploration of trauma and its effects on people. Take, for example, Toph. On the surface, she's one of the least complicated characters in the show. While she's blind, she found a way to overcome that setback and uses earthbending to see. She's a loudmouth, one who doesn't take anyone's nonsense, a badass, and has a strong sense of justice. She's awesome. But what do you think made her that way? Toph is part of the Beifong family, ultra-wealthy aristocrats described as...
They're the richest people in town. Probably the whole world.
But little is known about them, the residents of the town even saying they don't have a daughter. When investigated more, it's found that Toph, due to her blindness, has been kept from the world. Her parents haven't ever let her leave the grounds of their mansion, and nobody else in the wider world knows she exists. Her parents are oppressive and refuse to see Toph for who she could be. We see through the show that she is a perfectly functional person, independent and strong, but her parents can only see her as a meek little blind child. So not only are her parents abusive from a geographical standpoint, not letting her leave the grounds, but also refusing to acknowledge who she truly is, not letting her be herself. And I'm sure that feeling in particular can resonate with a lot of people. If you were thinking that that's all the extent of the abuse in this show would be, then buddy, you have no idea. Firelord Ozai, the primary villain of the whole show, is already a megalomaniacal, tyrannical, power-hungry warlord, but more than anything, he's just an abusive person. His quest for control stops at nothing. He wants to control the people around him, his country, and the world. And this includes his family. The tale of Zuko and Azula through the entire show is arguably the most compelling story of any. Two children, a brother and sister, exposed to very similar abuse in their home life and how it changed them. It's not quite two sides of the same coin here, it's more that these are two outcomes people can have when walking the same path. Zuko and Azula are two diverging paths from a fork in the same road. The full extent of Ozai's abuses to his family almost certainly aren't even covered in the show, but some are. In The Storm, the backstory of both Aang and Zuko is revealed, displaying more than anything their bond together, and the similar paths they've taken. And Zuko's story is harrowing, with it being revealed that because he spoke out of turn in a war meeting, not wanting to sacrifice troops on the front lines, he was challenged to an Agni Kai, a firebending duel, and was forced to fight his own father, something which he point-blank refused to do. But his father Ozai didn't refuse, permanently burning and marking his son with a scar on his face for the rest of his life. Ozai didn't just physically abuse his children though, he psychologically abused Zuko and Azula too, constantly pitting them against each other and making them resent each other. Because of Azula's natural skill for firebending, Ozai saw her as a weapon, a tool to be used for war, while Zuko was nothing but weak, and so those notions were reinforced. Azula thinking that Zuko was weak, Zuko thinking that Azula was the barrier between him and his father's affection. And because of this imbalance, their mother protected Zuko more than Azula, becoming his shield, which only led to an even further resentment between the two, each being jealous at the other's closeness with the opposite parent. The hunt for his father's affection is the entire point of Zuko's early arc. He needed to restore his honor, and by that he means he wanted his father to love him and appreciate him, something that was never attainable in the first place because of Ozai's manipulative nature. When Zuko gets burned by Ozai, the focus of this reaction shot is on Iroh's horror, not being able to watch what was happening. But you can also see Azula there, smiling, encouraged by this behavior. The inner sadist in her relishing in this moment, and that is emblematic of their relationship. She views Zuko as lesser, rightfully being taught a lesson, the only thing that could come between her and her father being taken down another level, her relationship with Ozai strengthening as Zuko's weakens. It's this unsettling, proprietary nature of Ozai and Azula's relationship that becomes the bedrock of Azula's motivations, with Ozai feeling like he owns her, or he's the only one who gets to use her and her abilities. It felt like Ozai was the only person Azula was aspiring to please, or be like, or look up to, and that's completely by Ozai's design. Azula was isolated from the rest of the family and her friends by Ozai reinforcing to her that she was superior to them, she should be viewing them as lesser, that they should be lucky to be in her presence. But it also only reinforced that Azula was worth anything because she was good at firebending, because she was useful to him, and if she wasn't, she would be like them. It's things like this that drove Azula to perfectionism when it came to her firebending, as we see in her introductory episode.
Almost perfect. One hair out of place.
Almost isn't good enough.
This drive comes from her deep-seated need to please her father and abide by his wishes. And unfortunately for everyone else around her, His wishes are that she continue in his footsteps and enact her superiority over those close to her. Azula only knows how to act like her father, how to use fear to control others. That's what she views as closeness to people. It's how her father controls her, so to her, showing love to somebody or being close to them is manipulating them. That's her relationship with her friends, Mai and Ty Lee, who are recruited to join Azula on her quest to hunt Zuko and the Avatar. Azula manipulates Ty Lee to join, threatening her at her circus show, not taking no for an answer. Mai joins the duo willingly as she's bored with her home life, but Azula still does manipulate her too. In the episode Return to Amashu, there was a trade set between both sides where the Fire Nation would hand over King Boomy, while the good guys would hand back Tom Tom, a baby they inadvertently led out of the city and, crucially, Mai's brother. But Azula puts a stop to it, suggesting that this isn't really a fair trade, and Mai complies, allowing her brother to remain kidnapped because Azula doesn't think he's worth as much as King Boomy. The cycle of torment continues. Ozai abuses Azula, who abuses Mai and Ty Lee. But what happens when that cycle is broken? In the double episode of The Boiling Rock, Mai intervenes on Zuko's behalf, saving him and going against the wishes of Azula. This confounds Azula, her perception of relationships being so warped and distorted that she can't recognize Mai and Zuko's closeness and love, and she thinks her fear-instilling control will supersede any other emotion Mai could have. Azula questions Mai, trying to get an answer that makes sense to her.
I never expected this from you. The thing I don't understand is why. Why would you do it? You know the consequences.
I guess you just don't know people as well as you think you do. You miscalculated. I love Zuko more than I fear you.
No, you miscalculated! You should have feared me more!
Mai tells Azula that her control over her isn't enough. She isn't strong enough, she isn't dominating enough, she isn't controlling enough. And you can see immediately what being told she's subpar does to her. The merest hint that she might not be perfect sends her into a spiral, and she lashes out. Someone who through the whole story to this point is always so calculating and composed loses her temper. The abuser has lost control. But then the cycle breaks even further, as immediately after this, Ty Lee sees Mai's bravery in standing up to Azula and is inspired, joining her in abandoning this abusive relationship. And now Azula has nobody left close to her to manipulate anymore. She had Zuko, Mai, and Ty Lee, and one by one, they each have left her, broken away from her reach and control, and Azula is left with nothing. The only cornerstone of her life remaining is her father, Ozai. And at the beginning of the show finale, that relationship grows strained too.
There has been a change of plans, Azula.
What?
I've decided to lead the fleet of airships to Ba Sing Se alone. You will remain here in the Fire Nation.
But I thought we were going to do this together.
My decision is final.
You can't treat me like this. You can't treat me like Zuko!
Zuko has joined Team Avatar. Mai and Ty Lee have turned against Azula, and now her father, in her eyes, is abandoning her, telling her that she isn't good enough to join him on his quest. She is once again being told she is subpar, she isn't perfect, and this snowball that began with Mai and Ty Lee's betrayal continues. Despite being placated with the title of Fire Lord, Azula is still feeling on edge, at a loss with nobody close to her remaining. She lashes out at servants, expecting the same perfection of them that she does of herself, and banishes everybody from the Fire Nation when her paranoia grows and grows. She banishes a servant for not de-pipping a cherry. She banishes the Dai Li for not coming to her side quick enough, musing that, despite them telling her they'd never betray her, they probably said the same thing to Long Feng, which means they can't be trusted. Losing Mai and Ty Lee, and the impossibility of that happening in her mind, has opened her up to potential betrayals on all sides. Lee and Lo tell Azula that she's banished all her servants, the Dai Li agents, the Imperial Firebenders, and they're concerned for her health, To which Azula remarks,
My father asked you to come here and talk to me, didn't he? He thinks I can't handle the responsibility of being Fire Lord.
it always comes back to her father's affection, what she thinks he'd want, and his perception of Azula. Her downward spiral continues, not having anyone left to do her hair for her. She attempts it herself, and she fails. With nobody left around her to support her, for her to manipulate or otherwise, Azula is left completely alone and begins having delusions and hallucinations. She sees her mother, the one parent she could never get through to, who always preferred Zuko to her, who could never show her the same affection, and the image of her tells Azula some uncomfortable truths.
I think you're confused. All your life you've used fear to control people, like your friends May and Ty Lee.
Well, what choice do I have? Trust is for fools. Fear is the only reliable way. Even you fear me.
No, I love you, Azula. I do.
Azula breaks. The fact that this is a hallucination she is creating in her mind means these are things that deep down Azula feels. She knows using fear to control people isn't the best thing to do. She knows it isn't reliable, even if she tries to justify it, and she knows her mother loved her. But now she's alone, and she breaks. This leads into one of the most emotionally poignant scenes in the entire show. Zuko and Azula finally having a showdown, with the power of Sozin's comet fueling them in an Agni Kai, both of their firebending prowess on full display. But Zuko, having learned the origin of firebending and its true purpose, is a stronger firebender for it, and Azula, having already broken and being over the edge, is weaker for it. It's such a tragic scene, these two siblings fighting to the death, perfectly enhanced by the choice to have no or muted sound effects, and just letting the sorrowful music wash over the fight. But it builds to a crescendo when Azula tries to take the easy way out, targeting Katara, who was not part of the fight, and Zuko sacrifices himself for her, leading to Katara needing to use her own waterbending mastery to take Azula down, showing her own growth from the start of the story. And after Azula is defeated, once again being made to feel subpar, this time with undeniable evidence that she is, she loses it, having a complete mental breakdown. And after everything Azula has done, after all the hurt and pain and abuse she personally has put people through, you can't help but feel sorry for her. More than anything else, she's a victim too, and this scene shows exactly what the consequences of abuse are. Azula fell deeply into Ozai's control, and this is what he caused her to be. It's so beautifully done that at the end of the day you just pity her. She's not to be hated when she so easily could have been. She's a victim who continued the cycle of abuse. This is Avatar, a show about trauma, about abusive relationships, and the effect they have on people. I know I've spoken a lot about all this darkness as part of Avatar, but I want to be clear that none of it is meant to put you off from watching or rewatching the show, or is a criticism of it. In fact, it enhances it, giving a more mature and deep meaning than any other show of its kind could. And I implore you now to go and watch or rewatch the show, because with this additional context, with this understanding of the deeper implications of the world, Avatar: The Last Airbender becomes something much greater than itself. It's a Nickelodeon show, yes. It's a fun, family-friendly adventure, yes. But more than that, Avatar: The Last Airbender is way darker than you remember, and it's a perfect TV show. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you want to watch more from me, why not check out my last video where I talk about why video game music is amazing and what it means to me. I've got a couple of really fun ideas for future videos that I'm working on currently, so stay tuned for those. I stream on Twitch, by the way, so follow me there if you're so inclined, and I'll see you in the next one.